Hi, and welcome to this presentation about modern testing for modern developers. My name is Amanda Dean, and I am a Senior Consultant with Planet. In this talk, I give an overview into how testing is changing and what this means for development teams and for teams that work with testers. So, who has seen this type of test before, where the details are step by step and need to be run one by one? And they're run by a test team who might sit in a different room, a different building, or maybe even a different country, and who you throw code to over the fence and they just throw defects back without any other real sort of communication. Now, this is a particular style of test, and it's the first type of test that most people learn. Unfortunately, it's the only type of test that some people ever learn or even are aware of. Now, this type of test is, in a lot of environments, an overhead, as it needs to be written and then executed. And that writing time can take place days to weeks or even months before a single test step can even be executed. And in that time, we could have had requirement changes, code changes, leading to tests that have to be updated and maintained, which, to be honest, is basically most testers' least favourite activity of all time. Even more than that, these tests can encourage testers to just follow that test step by step, which rules out the wonderful things that can happen when people think about the testing they're doing as they're running a test. Now, I don't want to completely knock these tests, as there are some times when they're absolutely necessary, including in regulatory environments where you do need to show that you've gone step by step to meet those requirements. But that's not every environment, and these test cases by themselves are not testing. Now, don't get me wrong, test cases are a tool that can be used in testing, but they alone are not testing. So if these aren't testing, what can we kind of do to have some better testing in our workplaces? Context-driven testing is, as its name suggests, testing that is based in the context of a project, rather than it being the same sort of testing for every single project we do. There's no copying and pasting of approaches or test plans or tests. Rather, we dive into a particular project with the particular people and work out what's important to test here at this point in time. So, how do we establish that context? Ask lots of questions. Build relationships with your stakeholders, with users and your operations teams. Get to know them and find out what's important to them for this particular piece of work. And the more skilled you are at building those relationships, the better you'll be able to be at identifying that context. So even two applications on the same platform will vary drastically in the way that we test it depending on how it's used. Let's take Salesforce, which is, quite big in the market at the moment. It's something that's incredibly customizable, and we'll want to look for very different things if the application is being used in different ways. So for example, if it's being used by an immigration department to process visas, we'll want to look at it very differently to what it would be used if we're using it as a customer relationship management system. And for a web page, a large corporate would want to test that differently for their business web page versus a mum and dad business. Partially because of the resources they have available and partially due to what they're looking to achieve out of that particular web page. We'll look at these things differently and have different test approaches for each of them. For me, risk-based testing goes nicely hand in hand with context-driven testing. To me, it's just an extension of the concepts where we don't just look at that context, but we also look at those risks and focus our testing around those areas where there are risks from the change. Again, to identify these risks, there's a lot of building relationships with stakeholders, but there are also tools that can be used to help identify those risks and information on how to run risk workshops and things like that. So if we're taking that immigration system we just talked about with Salesforce, we might focus hugely on the correctness of data displayed, because having something wrong could lead to some pretty serious impacts on people's lives. And the risk of the spelling mistake, for example, will vary drastically depending on that context. So in a lot of things that we test, a spelling mistake is quite a minor defect and people don't really worry about it. But if that spelling mistake could change the meaning of some information that could lead to decisions being made, then there's a much higher risk from that particular defect, and we'll deal with that quite differently. So, if test cases aren't testing, then what can we use instead? Now, this will absolutely depend on your context, but I personally love exploratory testing. Now, I know a lot of people think that exploratory testing is just going in and having a bit of a bash through the system, but exploratory testing is so much more than that. Exploratory testing is a skilled activity. It requires testers to look at the context and the risk, as well as their experience and knowledge to work out what to test. The testing is unscripted, but it's not unplanned. We go into an exploratory testing session with a plan. So, as an example, take a login page for a website. Obviously, we would look at testing correct credentials and incorrect credentials, and that there is the start of our plan. And I've just planned out 2 tests right there. But then that's our starting point. We'll also explore the system once we're looking at it and work out what it does, and so that we can provide information to our stakeholders about what the system does and what it doesn't do, so that they can make those informed decisions about whether we release or not. You know, what happens if I try a different password length? What happens if I put an emoji in the password field? Now, it's important to recognise that exploration does not mean there's no documentation. Notes can and should be taken throughout a testing session, whether that's on a session sheet, in an Excel spreadsheet, or there are tools that will record exploratory testing sessions for you. To summarise, test cases are a tool for testing, but in and of themselves are not actually testing. They're very valuable in certain circumstances, but in others they may be more overhead than what they're worth. And to work out what to test and how to test it, we need to start by looking at the context of the work and the risks involved in making that change. Thank you.